Toddlers saw a German shepherd pushing a basket. What happened next made everyone cry. You think you've seen kindness? Think again. What happened between a child and a wounded animal in the middle of nowhere has turned into one of the most heartwarming stories of the year. It's raw, it's real, and it will restore your faith in humanity. Don't forget to like, share, and tell us where you're watching from. The morning began like any other in the quiet little town. The sun had only just climbed over the hills, casting soft golden beams across rooftops and gardens. Dew still clung to the blades of grass, glimmering like tiny diamonds, and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread drifting from the bakery at the corner. Children's laughter was faint in the distance as school bags swung on tiny shoulders. The day promised peace, routine, and the comforting rhythm of small-town life. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that hearts would soon be shattered, or that a story would unfold that no one would ever forget. It was in this ordinary calm that the extraordinary appeared. Down the narrow cobblestone street, where neighbors often gathered to chat by the fences, a sudden hush fell. A movement caught the eye of the youngest among them. A toddler, no more than 3 years old, clutching a small toy rabbit in her chubby hands. She stopped mid-step, her innocent gaze fixed on something unusual at the far end of the lane. Her little finger rose, pointing, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "Doggy," she whispered. The adults turned, following her gesture. And then they saw it too. A large German shepherd was struggling forward, its massive frame low to the ground, its muscles straining as it pushed something along the uneven street. The sound was faint but haunting, the scrape of wicker against stone, the clatter of a basket's edge against the curb. It was not a playful dog carrying a toy. This was something different, something urgent, something heavy with meaning. The dog's paws pressed firmly against the cobbles, his chest heaving, ears flat, eyes narrowed with determination. With every push, the basket slid forward, wobbling, threatening to topple, yet the shepherd would not let it fall. He nudged it again with his nose, then braced his shoulder against it, forcing it further down the lane. His coat was matted, his body weary, but his spirit unbroken. A gasp rippled through the small crowd that had begun to form. Neighbors emerged from doorways, half curious, half alarmed. Mothers clutched their children closer. Elders squinted from porches, whispering amongst themselves. "What on earth is he doing? Whose dog is that? Why is he carrying a basket?" The murmurs grew louder, tangled with unease. No one dared step forward. No one could look away. The toddler, however, did not flinch. Her wide eyes, round as marbles, followed every movement. Where adults saw strangeness, she saw something else, a struggle, a purpose, perhaps even a plea. Her tiny hand reached toward the shepherd as though she could bridge the distance between them with nothing more than the innocence of her heart. The dog paused for a moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His gaze swept across the faces staring at him, pausing, just for an instant, on the little girl. His eyes were deep pools of exhaustion and sorrow, but also of something else, something unspoken. Then, without hesitation, he pushed again, the basket rattling forward as though it contained the weight of his very soul. Speculation spread quickly among the townsfolk. Some whispered it might be food, others belongings. A few feared something worse, though no one dared say it aloud. The mystery of the basket gripped them as tightly as the sight of the dog itself. Every push carried a question, every scrape against stone echoed with dread. And yet, in the center of all the uncertainty, the toddler's expression never wavered. Her eyes shone not with fear but with wonder, as though she understood, in a way no adult could, that this was not a random act. This was a message, a mission. The shepherd pressed on, muscles trembling, tail dragging low. The basket, stubborn and heavy, seemed to resist him at every turn. But he refused to stop. Step by step, push by push, he inched forward, as though nothing else in the world mattered. By now, the entire street had fallen silent. The only sounds were the rasp of the dog's breath, the scrape of the basket, and the faint flutter of the toddler's giggle as she clapped her tiny hands, unaware that she had just pointed out the beginning of a mystery that would change all their lives. A German shepherd, a simple basket, and a little girl's innocent cry. It seemed so small, so ordinary. But it was only the beginning. And before the day ended, every person who stood on that street would be moved to tears by the truth of what that basket carried and the loyalty that refused to die. The day had begun with the kind of charm only small towns seem to hold. In that little corner of the world, mornings carried a rhythm of peace. The sunlight poured gently across rooftops, painting them in shades of gold. Birds gathered on fences, their songs mingling with the distant chime of the church bell. There was no rush, no honking traffic, no overwhelming noise. Just the familiar sounds of a town waking up slowly, the way it always had. Inside one of the neat brick houses on Maple Lane, a toddler's laughter rang out like a melody. Emily, bright-eyed, curly-haired, and barely 3, toddled across the porch in her soft blue dress. Her tiny feet pattered against the wooden boards as she clutched a stuffed rabbit almost as big as herself. For her, mornings were never ordinary. They were adventures waiting to unfold, even if the adventure was nothing more than chasing a butterfly or stacking blocks in the grass. Her world was small but filled with wonder. Every sound was music, every sight a story. She squealed when the wind caught her curls, giggled at the neighbor's cat stretching on the fence, and clapped her hands when a robin swooped low. Emily's mother watched from the doorway, sipping her coffee with the patient smile of someone who knew her child's joy was the heartbeat of the home. The warmth of family life wrapped around Emily like a blanket. Breakfast smells lingered from the kitchen, warm toast and strawberry jam. Her father's laughter echoed faintly as he polished his bike for the day's ride. From the street, friendly voices called out greetings, neighbors exchanging waves as they tended gardens or walked their dogs. Everything felt safe, ordinary, predictable. But life, as it so often does, has a way of surprising us in the very moments we least expect it. Emily had wandered toward the white picket fence, her stuffed rabbit dragging along the ground. She pressed her tiny face between the slats, her eyes scanning the street with that curiosity only children carry. And then she froze. At first, she thought she saw nothing more than a dog. Dogs were not unusual here. Every second yard had one. But this was different. The shepherd's body was tense, straining, his nose pressed hard against something large. She blinked once, then again. The dog was pushing a basket. Her little lips parted. A smile tugged at the corners, followed quickly by an eager point of her finger. "Doggy," she squealed. Her mother chuckled softly, glancing over her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart, that's a dog." She assumed Emily's fascination was nothing new. Children were always enchanted by animals. But Emily didn't stop pointing. Her tiny brows furrowed in concentration as she pressed her finger harder toward the street. "Doggy, basket." This time, her mother squinted. Sure enough, a German shepherd was there, shoulders heaving as he shoved at a wicker basket that scraped along the cobblestones. The sight was strange enough, but she brushed it off. Perhaps he was playing with something abandoned. Perhaps it wasn't important. She smiled down at her daughter. "Dogs do funny things, Emily. Come on now, let's go back inside." But the toddler shook her head with unusual stubbornness. "No, doggy working." Her mother blinked, caught off guard by the seriousness in her child's voice. Emily rarely spoke in such tones. There was no giggle, no lightness, just conviction. Across the street, An elderly neighbor paused while trimming roses. She followed Emily's pointing hand and frowned. The shepherd was still at it, pushing with his nose, then his shoulder, dragging the basket further and further. He wasn't playing. His movements were deliberate, filled with an urgency no one could explain. "What's he doing with that thing?" the neighbor muttered aloud. Soon another passerby slowed, curiosity pulling them in. Then another. Within minutes, more pairs of eyes were watching. Some shrugged it off as a stray's odd behavior. Others found themselves unsettled by the determination in his every movement. Emily remained fixed to the spot, her small hands gripping the fence rail as though she knew something the grown-ups didn't. In her gaze there was no mockery, no dismissal, only quiet recognition. To her, the shepherd wasn't just moving a basket. He was trying with all his might to carry out something important. Her father stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on here?" "The dog," her mother explained, almost with a laugh. "He's been pushing that basket down the street. Emily thinks it's something important." Her father looked over, his brow furrowing. The shepherd's coat was dirty, his paws raw from the cobblestones, yet he didn't falter. He kept pressing forward, again and again, eyes focused as though nothing else mattered. "That's no game," the father murmured. The toddler tugged on his pant leg, eyes shining with urgency. "Help him, Daddy." It was in that moment that the contrast struck everyone, the laughter of a child against the weary determination of a dog. Sunshine filled the street, birds still sang, but beneath that normalcy was a scene so strange it made the heart pause. The ordinary day had twisted into something else. Something that carried mystery in every push of the basket and every whisper of the child who refused to look away. For the adults, it was puzzling. For Emily, it was simple. The dog wasn't lost. He wasn't playing. He had a mission. And she, the smallest voice in the crowd, was the first to recognize it. The German shepherd did not move like a stray wandering without purpose. His every motion carried weight, his body trembling with exhaustion but his eyes burning with a strange intensity. His paws were scraped from the cobblestones, his ribs visible beneath his thick coat, yet he kept pushing the wicker basket forward. His nose pressed against it, then his shoulder, and the scraping sound echoed against the quiet houses as neighbors slowly gathered to watch. It was not the sound of play, it was the sound of struggle, of determination that no one could quite understand. Windows creaked open and doors swung wide as curious faces appeared. Soon half the street was watching, their voices rising in hushed confusion. "Whose dog is this?" one whispered. "Why is he pushing a basket?" another muttered. Some chuckled, treating it as an odd morning distraction, while others frowned, uneasy with the sight of such desperate effort. The shepherd's eyes darted across the onlookers, not wild but searching, pleading as though he wanted to speak. For a brief moment, his gaze met the toddler's, tiny Emily, her curls shining in the sunlight as she clung to the fence. She tilted her head, watching with a seriousness beyond her years, then whispered with conviction, "He wants us to follow him." Her words cut through the murmur of the crowd. Some laughed, brushing off the child's imagination, but others shifted uncomfortably, wondering if there was more truth in her innocence than in their own doubt. The dog pushed the basket again, his breathing harsh, his muscles quivering. When a large man in work boots stepped forward, muttering, "Let's just see what's in there," and reached for the basket, the shepherd lunged protectively. A deep growl thundered from his chest, his teeth bared, his body angled between the basket and the stranger. It wasn't the senseless aggression of a dangerous dog. It was a warning, a declaration that whatever lay inside was not to be touched. The man stumbled back, startled, and the crowd gasped in unison. Speculation ran wild. Some whispered that the basket held food, others muttered about discarded belongings, and a few dark thoughts hung unspoken in the air. But Emily's little voice rose above it all. She gripped the fence so tightly her tiny knuckles turned white. "He's not bad," she said firmly. "He's scared. He wants us to see." Her mother bent down, trying to hush her, but the child's eyes never wavered. She believed in the shepherd's purpose in a way none of the adults could. Another neighbor, kinder than the rest, crouched low and called softly, "It's okay, boy. Let us help." For a moment the shepherd froze, his ears flicking, his head tilting slightly as if torn between desperation and trust. But then, with renewed urgency, he shoved the basket harder, dragging it away from her outstretched hand, determined to keep moving. The wicker rattled violently, almost tipping over, and the entire street held its breath. With a swift, practiced motion, the shepherd braced his body against it, steadying it just in time. His chest heaved as he let out a shuddering breath, but he did not stop. It became clear to everyone that this was no game. This was a mission. Whatever was in that basket was more precious to him than his own safety. And yet, despite the crowd of adults debating and hesitating, it was Emily, the smallest voice among them, who understood. She whispered it again, almost like a prayer carried on the morning breeze. "He wants us to follow him." The shepherd pressed on, step by painful step, ignoring the whispers, the laughter, the hands that tried to interfere. He was weary, beaten down, but his spirit burned bright. The scraping of the basket echoed across the cobblestones like a heartbeat, demanding to be heard. The crowd could not know it yet, but the truth lay hidden in that wicker container. And before the day ended, Emily's words would prove truer than anything else spoken that morning. For a long moment, no one dared to move. The German shepherd stood guard over the basket, his body trembling with fatigue but his eyes blazing with defiance. The air hung thick with uncertainty, whispers floating like restless birds above the gathered crowd. Some were frightened, others merely curious, but all of them were bound by the same question: what could possibly be so precious inside that basket that a dog would risk everything to protect it? It was Emily's father who finally stepped forward, his hands raised slowly, his voice low and calm. "Easy there, boy," he said gently, as if speaking to a frightened child. "No one's here to hurt you." The shepherd's growl rumbled deep in his chest, but he did not lunge this time. Instead, he shifted slightly, his head tilting as though he recognized something in the man's tone. For the first time, it seemed as though he might allow someone near. The neighbors watched in silence, the weight of suspense pressing on their shoulders. With cautious steps, Emily's father crouched by the basket. The shepherd's eyes never left him, muscles taut, every fiber ready to defend. Slowly, the man reached out, fingers brushing the wicker handle. The dog let out a warning whine, but did not strike. And then, with the gentlest motion, he lifted the lid. A hush fell over the street. Inside was not food, not garbage, not something dangerous. Instead, carefully tucked within the basket, lay an old, faded blanket. Its edges were frayed, worn by time, carrying the faint smell of dust and memory. Resting atop the folds were a pair of tiny baby shoes, scuffed but neatly kept, their laces tied in bows. Beneath them, wrapped carefully, were photographs, black and white, some yellowed with age, their corners bent from years of handling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. A man muttered, "I know those shoes. I've seen them before." The fragments of recognition stirred something deep within the older neighbors, who exchanged looks heavy with sorrow. And then, slowly, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, the truth emerged. "That's the basket," whispered Mrs. Henson, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. Her voice trembled with memory. It belonged to the Matthews family. Murmurs rose immediately. The Matthews, once well loved in the town, had lived in the very house that now stood abandoned at the corner of the street. Years ago, tragedy had struck. Their infant daughter had passed suddenly, and the grief was too heavy for the family to bear. They had moved away not long after, leaving behind only fragments of their life. The basket had been one of those fragments, always seen in their front window, holding the baby's toys, shoes, and blankets. Eyes turned back to the shepherd, who stood tall now, his body no longer pushing forward but standing protectively over the basket, as if to say, "This is not junk, this is memory." His loyalty had kept him near it, guarding what remained of the family he had once belonged to. One by one, the neighbors began to recall. "He was their dog," a man said softly, snapping his fingers as the memory returned. "Yes, he was always by Mr. Matthews' side, always watching the baby carriage. He used to sit on their porch all day, waiting for his master." Mrs. Henson nodded tearfully. "I remember how he'd climb onto the roof sometimes when Mr. Matthews was fixing the gutters. He'd sit up there, watching, as though he was afraid to let his master out of sight. Such a loyal creature, never left that family's side." The realization settled heavily over everyone. This was no stray. This was a dog carrying grief older than Emily herself. While the family had gone, he had remained, clinging to the last pieces of the life they left behind. The basket was not just wicker and cloth. It was a reliquary of love, of loss, of memories he refused to abandon. Emily pressed her face against the fence, her little voice breaking the silence. "He misses them," she whispered. The crowd turned to her, startled by the simple truth in her words. Her eyes glistened, too young to fully understand death, but old enough to recognize sorrow. "He's keeping their things safe." The shepherd's ears perked at her voice. Slowly, almost cautiously, he turned his gaze toward her. For the first time, his eyes softened, and the weariness behind them showed. He let out a low, aching whine that echoed with loneliness no human could mistake. In that sound, every heart in the crowd seemed to break at once. The dog had carried his vigil for years, unseen, unheard, still guarding the memories of the people he loved. The basket was his mission, his burden, his sacred promise. Tears welled in the eyes of neighbors who had once walked past that old house without a thought. They remembered the laughter that used to fill it, the sight of the little girl toddling on the lawn, the way the shepherd had always been at her side. And now, standing in the middle of the street, he was still carrying out that duty, even when there was no one left to notice. Emily's mother clutched her chest, whispering, "My God, he's grieving." The town, for the first time in years, felt the weight of its own forgotten past. They had moved on, as people often do, but the shepherd had not. He had remained behind, loyal beyond reason, holding on to the pieces of a love that tragedy had torn apart. And it was the innocence of a child, the clear eyes of a toddler, that had forced them all to see what they had ignored. The truth in the basket was not just objects. It was a story, a memory, a testimony to devotion that outlasted loss. And the German shepherd, tired though he was, stood tall beside it, daring anyone to take that truth from him. The street was silent except for the labored panting of the German shepherd. His chest heaved, his body quivered, but still he stood guard over the basket as though the whole world depended on it. The neighbors, shaken by what they had just seen inside, exchanged uneasy glances. They understood now that this was not a random dog and not a meaningless object. But still, the basket was fragile, and the sight of the weary animal trembling in the heat filled them with worry. Something had to be done. A man in a flannel shirt stepped forward, his palms raised as though approaching a wild horse. "Easy, boy," he said softly, inching closer. "We just want to help you. You don't need to carry this anymore." His words were gentle, but the shepherd immediately bristled. A low growl rolled from his throat, his ears flattening, his body angling protectively over the wicker. His eyes flared with warning. This basket was not to be taken. The man hesitated, then backed away. Another neighbor, a young woman, tried her luck. She crouched low, offering her hand, whispering soothing sounds. But the shepherd only grew more frantic, pacing in tight circles around the basket, pushing it this way and that, as if terrified someone would snatch it away. His growls turned to whines, sharp and aching, his body torn between exhaustion and desperation. He could not let go. Not now. Not ever. The crowd murmured, hearts aching at the sight. "He'll make himself sick," one said. "He's going to collapse." Another whispered, "Why won't he let us help?" The truth was clear. The basket was all he had left of the family he loved. It wasn't just an object, it was his whole world. To take it away was to strip him of the last fragile thread connecting him to his past. And so he fought, even against kindness, unwilling to risk losing what he had guarded for years. Through all the confusion, Emily had not moved from her place at the fence. Her wide eyes shimmered with tears, but not fear. She seemed to see something the others couldn't, some secret written in the shepherd's desperate gaze. Slowly, she pulled away from her mother's grasp and toddled toward the dog. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her mother called out, panic in her voice, but the child did not stop. Her tiny shoes pattered against the stones, each step carrying more courage than her years should have allowed. The shepherd's head snapped up as she approached. His growl faltered. His body stiffened, uncertain. Emily stopped a few feet away, her little hands outstretched, her voice trembling but clear. "It's okay, doggy," she whispered. "I won't take it. I promise." The crowd held its breath. Every eye was locked on the fragile scene. This tiny child standing before a desperate animal, unafraid. The shepherd's breathing slowed, though his body still trembled. His gaze darted from the basket to the girl, then back again, torn between instinct and something softer that flickered faintly in his weary eyes. Emily took another step, then another. Her voice, delicate as a lullaby, filled the silence. "You're a good boy. You kept it safe. You don't have to be scared. I'll help you now." The German shepherd's ears twitched. His growl softened into a whine, low and aching. He lowered his head slightly, his eyes glistening with exhaustion. The crowd could hardly believe it. The dog who had snarled at grown men, who had lunged at anyone daring to touch the basket, was now trembling before the innocent trust of a child. Emily knelt slowly, her small fingers reaching out but stopping just short of the basket. "Can I see it?" she whispered, as though asking his permission. The shepherd hesitated. For a heartbeat the air was heavy with tension, the crowd ready to leap if something went wrong. But then, in a moment that felt almost holy, the great dog exhaled a long, shuddering breath and stepped aside. His head bowed, his body sagging as though surrendering to a truth even he could not deny. He led her near. Emily's tiny hands brushed the worn wicker, her touch feather-light. She smiled through her tears. "Thank you, doggy," she said softly. The shepherd let out a faint whimper and pressed his nose gently against her knee, his body collapsing beside her as if finally allowing himself to rest. The crowd erupted in emotion. Some wept openly, hands covering their faces, unable to contain the wave of feeling that rushed through them. Others clutched their children close, overwhelmed by the purity of what they had just witnessed. A silence followed, not of fear, but of reverence. They had seen something rare, something profound. A grieving heart soothed not by force, not by reason, but by the innocence of a child who offered only love. Emily stroked the shepherd's fur with her tiny fingers, whispering again and again, "It's okay now. You're safe." The dog closed his eyes, a heavy sigh escaping his chest as though he had carried his burden for far too long and had finally found someone to share it with. And as the town looked on, hearts breaking and healing all at once, they knew they would never forget this moment. It was not strength or authority that saved the shepherd from his grief. It was the gentle courage of a toddler, the smallest voice in the crowd, whose innocence pierced through sorrow and reminded everyone watching of the simplest truth. Sometimes, love is enough. The shepherd lay where he had finally surrendered, head on Emily's knee, ribs rising and falling like someone learning to breathe again, until his legs simply gave out. A whimper escaped him, not from fear this time, but from the exhaustion of carrying too much, too long. Someone brought water. Someone else spread a blanket. The basket, so fiercely guarded moments ago, sat at Emily's side as if it too had decided to rest. Her mother, Maya, moved in slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "Honey, let's take him home." Emily nodded, still stroking the dog's cheek with her small hand. She didn't ask permission from anyone. She asked it from him, tilting her face to meet his soft, clouded eyes. "Come, doggy," she said. "Come home." They lifted him together, two neighbors at the shoulders, Maya supporting his hindquarters. He didn't fight. He didn't even look back. Emily walked beside them, one hand on his paw as though she were the one giving strength. The basket went too. No one suggested otherwise. At the house, the kitchen turned into a tiny clinic. Warm towels, quiet voices, the kettle sighing on the stove. Emily fetched her own baby blanket and draped it over the shepherd's back with the serious care of a nurse. "He's cold," she told her mother. "He needs soft." Maya cupped her daughter's face, kissed her forehead, and said what felt truer than anything she'd said in years, "You are the bravest person I know." The local vet, Dr. Hart, arrived in rubber boots and a windbreaker, hair still damp from the weather. She knelt without fuss, the way you kneel to pray. "He's dehydrated," she murmured, fingers moving gently over the dog's spine. "And exhausted. But his heart is steady." The shepherd watched her with a wary calm, alert, but too tired to posture. When the stethoscope chilled his ribs, he flinched. When Emily pressed her hand to his paw, he settled. Dr. Hart noticed, and her voice softened. "He trusts the little one," she said to Maya. "That's the best medicine I could ask for." They offered a shallow dish of broth first, then water. He lapped carefully, like someone who remembered hunger as a wound. His tail, limp for so long, tapped once against the floorboards. Emily clapped a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with joy. "He said thank you," she whispered. The room believed her. They named him later that night, after the towels had been changed, after the neighbors had drifted home and the kitchen smelled like chamomile and damp fur. "Atlas," Maya suggested, looking at the basket tucked by the doorway. "He's been carrying a world." Emily tried the name on her tongue and giggled. "Atlas," she said, proud of herself. The dog blinked, and if a blink can be acceptance, that's what it was. The first days moved slow, like wading through a dream. Atlas slept as though sleep was a debt to be paid. Sometimes he woke with a start at small sounds, silverware clinking, a door closing 2 rooms away, and his chest would race until Emily laid her palm over his ribs. "It's just spoons," she'd tell him gravely. "Spoons aren't scary." On the 3rd afternoon, thunder growled far off. Atlas crept under the kitchen table and pressed his nose to the basket, trembling. Emily followed him there, crawling on her elbows like a soldier in a movie, and tucked herself against his side. "I'm here," she told the storm. "And he's here." The storm moved on. They stayed put, a secret fort of table legs and courage. Dr. Hart stopped by each morning, leaving behind advice and a bag of food that smelled like roasted chicken. "Tiny meals," she said, warm, gentle on his stomach. Maya followed the instructions like a recipe more sacred than any cookbook. She warmed the broth till steam curled like a ribbon, let it cool, then watched Atlas drink. When his head drooped, Emily wiped his muzzle with the tenderness of a child caring for a doll. The basket lived by the back door, not because anyone told it to, but because that's where Atlas nudged it with his nose each time he woke. Inside lay the faded blanket, the baby shoes with their laces tied into a heart-shaped knot, the photographs curling at the corners. They didn't touch the contents without him. Sometimes he would rest his chin on the rim and stare, not sad exactly, but remembering. Emily would sit beside him and narrate the photos in her own language. "That's a baby," she'd say solemnly. "He had very small feet. Like beans." Atlas would huff, a sound that seemed to hold laughter and loss in the same breath. Word traveled, as it does in towns where everyone has stood in the same post office line at least once. Bread arrived at the doorstep. A quilt appeared, hand-stitched with paw prints along the border. An elderly man from Maple Street carved a nameplate out of walnut, Atlas, with a tiny basket beside the letters. Even the teenagers, who normally moved in a cloud of earbuds and impatience, paused on the sidewalk to peer over the fence. One of them, the boy who rides a skateboard too fast for his knees, left a squeaky rubber ball on the porch with no note and ran away before anyone could say thank you. Atlas learned the house like a song. He discovered where the sun pooled on the living room rug every morning and claimed it, belly exposed, toes twitching when sleep took him someplace less heavy. He learned the creak of the hallway floor 2 steps before Emily's bedroom, the one you avoid when you're sneaking in to make sure she's still asleep. He learned that the sound of the mail flap was harmless, that bathwater meant a towel afterward, and that Emily's sock drawer held treasures, stickers, a rock shaped like a heart, a stale cracker reserved for emergencies only. He followed Emily everywhere, not as a shadow but as a witness. When she built block towers, he guarded the perimeter as though gravity were a burglar. When she colored, he lay with his paws touching the edges of the paper, careful not to smudge. When she toddled toward the garden gate, he rose, every inch of him a gentle fence. "He protects me," she announced to Maya one afternoon, tomato sauce on her chin and absolute certainty in her eyes. "And I protect him back." Trust came in small acts, then in cascades. The first time Atlas fell asleep with his back to the basket, Maya cried quietly into the dish towel, pretending she was drying a plate. The first time he trotted to the door and barked once, just once, because he needed the yard, the whole house applauded. He startled, and then wagged so hard his hips swayed. Emily spun in a circle, dizzy with joy. "He asked," she squealed. "He asked with his mouth." Sundays became their ritual. After breakfast, the 3 of them, Emily in her yellow boots, Atlas in his new collar with the walnut name tag, Maya with coffee in a paper cup, walked the few blocks to the little park where the maple trees make a green roof in summer. People turned from benches and blankets, hands rising in unison to wave. "How's our hero?" someone would call. Atlas lowered his head politely, as if embarrassed by the attention. Children came one by one to offer a polite ear scratch the way Dr. Hart had taught them, palm open, voice soft, no surprises. Atlas accepted each greeting with solemn diplomacy until a toddler dropped a cracker at his feet. He glanced at Maya, then at Emily. Emily nodded like a queen bestowing knighthood. "You may," she said. Atlas ate the cracker. There were setbacks, because healing is not a straight road. One evening, a trash truck clanged against a dumpster and Atlas flattened, trembling as if the sky itself had splintered. Emily didn't speak. She simply slid her small body over his, a blanket of a child, and hummed tunelessly. When the noise passed, he lifted his head and bumped it softly against her cheek. It left a smudge of engine dust on her skin that Maya couldn't bring herself to wipe away for a long minute. The basket changed too. It stayed by the door, yes, but its power shifted from anchor to artifact. Emily began to tuck things into it, dandelion crowns, a drawing of 3 stick figures, one with triangle ears, a ribbon she declared very fancy. Once, she tucked her own favorite stuffed rabbit inside and patted the blanket. "For sharing," she told Atlas. He looked from the rabbit to the photo of the baby and back again. Then he rested his paw gently on the basket's rim and left it there, as if to say that the past and the present could sit together without breaking. By the first crisp day of autumn, Atlas had gained weight and a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His coat shone. He trotted instead of trudged. He smiled, there is no other word for it, when Emily's feet thumped down the hallway in the morning. On the porch, a new sign hung beside the doorbell. "Please knock gently. A hero naps here." Someone in town, no one would admit who, had taped a handwritten note beneath it, the ink a little smudged from dew. "Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Atlas, for reminding us what love does." And on a golden afternoon, when the maple leaves looked like flames catching slow, Maya watched from the kitchen window as her daughter toddled across the yard with a small blanket draped over one arm. Atlas dozed in the grass, the basket within reach but not under guard, his mouth parted in a dog's dream. Emily spread the blanket over him, smoothing it carefully as he blinked awake. "Soft," she said. "Warm." Atlas sighed, a sound like a story ending well, and laid his head on her lap. The two of them, child and shepherd, stayed like that until the sun slid low, a picture so tender the whole street seemed to walk quieter, talk softer, breathe easier. No one could say who had started it, but before long, people left small kindnesses at the gate, a bouquet from the community garden, a bag of treats with, "For Atlas," spelled in shaky crayon, a framed copy of the photo someone had snapped the day the dog finally allowed the toddler to touch the basket. It hung on the hallway wall now, right at a child's height. Emily passed it every day, tapping the glass with a fingertip. "That was brave," she'd tell him. "We were both brave." The town believed it too, that courage could be as small as a hand, as big as a heart, that loyalty could survive storms and years, that healing could start in the simplest of gestures. A sip of broth, a quiet hum, a blanket tucked just so. And if you happened to walk down that street at evening, you might see them on the porch, Atlas with his chin on the toddler's knee, the basket beside them like a memory that finally knows it can rest. The days rolled into weeks, and the story of the German shepherd and the little girl became less of a headline and more of a heartbeat in the town. People no longer gathered on the sidewalk to whisper or speculate. Instead, they carried the memory quietly inside themselves, as if they had each been entrusted with a secret. Yet the sight of Atlas and Emily walking together, the basket swaying gently in the dog's mouth or resting near his side, always stirred something tender. It was a reminder, unspoken but deeply felt, that loyalty does not vanish with the people we lose. It lingers, in objects, in places, in the silent corners of memory, waiting to be honored by those who are willing to see. The basket, once a mystery that confused and frightened, had become a symbol. It sat by the doorway still, but it no longer radiated the sorrow of a shrine. Instead, it pulsed with quiet devotion. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, their eyes tracing the worn wicker, the faded baby shoes, the soft blanket that smelled faintly of the past. They would lower their voices without realizing, as though standing in a sacred place. Children, who had once pointed and giggled, now asked questions in hushed tones. "Why does he love it so much?" And the adults, wiser after watching the shepherd's journey, would answer, "Because it holds someone he loved." In that explanation, a kind of reverence grew, a lesson not in words but in feelings. Emily, though too young to understand history or loss, understood something greater. She knew the basket mattered, not because of what it held but because of what it meant. She treated it with the same respect Atlas did, never tugging, never teasing. Sometimes she brought her own treasures and tucked them carefully inside. Her favorite hair ribbon, a scribbled drawing, a wildflower she had picked in the park. Atlas would watch her with solemn eyes, as if acknowledging her offering, and together they would sit beside it in silence. What the world saw as old belongings, Emily and Atlas saw as a bridge between yesterday and today. At night, when the lamps glowed and the crickets sang in the yard, a new ritual unfolded in the little house. Where once Atlas had guarded the basket with desperate vigilance, now Emily guarded him. Each evening, after Maya whispered goodnight and tucked her daughter into bed, Emily would tiptoe back into the kitchen where Atlas slept. In her small hands she carried a child's blanket, pink with faded stars. She would spread it gently over the shepherd's back, her voice soft but steady. "So you stay warm, doggy. So you stay safe." Atlas would shift, sighing the kind of sigh that belongs only to the deeply tired, then lay his head back down. It was a reversal, as if the child had become protector, and the great animal had finally allowed himself to rest like a child. The symbolism did not escape anyone who witnessed it. The town spoke of it in quiet wonder, how a toddler had become a healer, how a dog had laid down his grief in exchange for trust. In moments like these, wisdom surfaces, the kind that sermons or textbooks cannot deliver, but that life reveals in flashes through the simplest acts. Adults in the town admitted, often in private, that they had forgotten how loyalty feels when it is pure. They had buried it under schedules, under bills, under the gray weight of practicality. But the shepherd had remembered, and a child had seen him. Together, they stitched loyalty and love back into the fabric of everyday life. Sometimes children see truths that adults forget, that grief is not weakness, that love doesn't expire with death, that healing often begins when we stop trying to control and simply start to care. The basket became more than a container of relics. It became a living metaphor. For some, it represented the memories of a spouse long gone. For others, the photographs of parents they wished they could call one more time. For many, it was a reminder that loyalty can survive storms, hunger, years, even silence. It can survive until someone, like Atlas, chooses to guard it with their life. And when the burden grows too heavy, it only takes one hand, small, innocent, fearless, to lift the weight and share it. As autumn deepened and leaves drifted in amber spirals to the ground, Atlas and Emily were inseparable. People said they seemed less like a child and a dog, and more like two souls bound by some ancient promise. When Emily toddled to the park, Atlas padded behind her. When she stumbled, he steadied her with the press of his shoulder. When he whimpered in his sleep, she was there with her blanket. Each gave the other what they needed most: trust, companionship, a reason to keep going. And perhaps that was the deepest truth of all, that healing is not a destination but a bond. Atlas healed not because he forgot his past, but because someone walked into his grief without fear. Emily grew not because she learned lessons from books, but because she carried the wisdom of compassion in her tiny hands. Together, they taught a town that loyalty, love, and healing are not grand gestures but daily choices. To guard what matters, to share the burden, to believe that even in the shadow of sorrow, joy can bloom again. So when night fell and the street grew quiet, anyone passing by the little house might glimpse the final scene: a shepherd asleep, a toddler's blanket tucked over his shoulders, the basket resting close by. And in that picture lay a story of loss and devotion, of innocence and courage, of two unlikely healers who found each other at the edge of despair. It was a story that whispered its own moral, clear and timeless. Loyalty doesn't die. Love lingers. And sometimes, it takes the smallest among us to remind the rest of the world what truly matters. This was not just a story of a dog in a basket. It was not only about a toddler's courage or a town's compassion. It was a story of love that refused to fade, of loyalty that endured beyond loss, and of healing that came in the most unexpected way. The basket, worn and fragile, was more than an object. It was a vessel of devotion, a reminder that the bonds we form in life do not vanish when the people we love are gone. They linger in the things they touched, in the places they cherished, and in the hearts of those who remember. And perhaps that's why the shepherd's journey moved so many. Because deep down, we all carry our own basket, a memory, a photograph, a keepsake of someone we can never forget. And like Atlas, we guard it fiercely until the day comes when love transforms that burden into a gift to share. So if this story touched your heart, let it remind you that loyalty never truly breaks and love never truly leaves. Share it with someone who still believes in bonds that time cannot weaken. Because sometimes, the smallest hands, the gentlest voices, and the simplest gestures show us the eternal truth: love endures. Boys.